$50. That was the price of Avery's dignity at the Oakhaven County tax auction. When the wooden gavel slammed, the room erupted into vicious, mocking laughter. They saw a rocky, overgrown sliver of useless dirt. They called him the town fool. But those unkempt weeds were hiding a botanical gold mine. The air inside the Oakhaven Community Center was thick with the smell of stale, coffee-damp wool and the distinct arrogance of men who owned thousands of acres of fertile soil. Up at the front, auctioneer Thomas Davies adjusted his spectacles, looking down at the final item on the county's delinquent tax list. "All right, folks, we have one last parcel," Thomas announced, his voice lacking any of the theatrical rhythm he usually reserved for prime real estate. Lot 42, B, a quarter-acre triangular wedge situated between the old Union Pacific rail spur and the eastern boundary of the Miller farm. Bidding starts at, let's say, $50, just to cover the county paperwork. A collective scoff rolled through the folding chairs. Everyone in Oakhaven knew Lot 42B. It was a local joke, a steep, rocky ravine, thoroughly choked by a chaotic tangle of invasive brambles, creeping vines, and towering aggressive weeds. It was completely inaccessible to modern farm machinery, legally complicated by the railroad right-of-way, and universally considered an absolute eyesore. Jebediah Miller, the undisputed corn king of the county, leaned back in his front-row seat and hooked his thumbs into his suspenders. "Tell you what, Thomas," Jeb bellowed, drawing chuckles from his neighbors. "You pay me $50 and I'll park my rusted-out combine on it. That's all that dirt is good for." The room roared with laughter. In the back row, Avery Pendleton sat motionless. At 42, Avery was a man who had been thoroughly chewed up by the corporate agricultural machine. Once a promising soil scientist and field botanist for a major firm in Portland, a hostile takeover had left him without a pension, without a job, and retreating to the rural quiet of Oakhaven with dwindling savings. He didn't have the capital to buy a working farm, but he had something no one else in that room possessed: an eye for microclimates and a deep encyclopedic knowledge of native flora. Avery raised his numbered paddle. $50. The laughter died instantly, replaced by the collective swiveling of 60 heads. Jeb Miller turned around, his eyes narrowing under the brim of his John Deere cap. "You feeling all right, Avery?" Jeb drawled, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "You going to farm gravel and poison ivy, or are you just opening a sanctuary for stray raccoons?" $50 is the bid," Avery said, quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. Thomas cleared his throat, clearly bewildered. "I have $50 from Mr. Pendleton. Do I hear 55, anyone?" Silence hung heavy in the room. No sane man would pay a dime for that cursed slope. "Going once. Going twice." Sold to Avery Pendleton for $50. As the gavel cracked against the block, the whispers began. Fool. City boy. Throwing his last pennies down a rocky drain. Avery ignored them, quietly walking to the clerk's desk to hand over a crisp $50 bill. He didn't care about their mockery, because Avery had walked past Lot 42B 3 days prior, and beneath the dense protective canopy of thorny blackberry bushes and Virginia creeper, he had spotted a highly distinct 5-pronged leaf cluster. And then he saw another, and another. The town thought it was just a patch of obnoxious weeds, but Avery knew exactly what he was looking at: a virgin, untouched, decades-old colony of Panax quinquefolius, wild American ginseng. Due to overharvesting and habitat destruction, mature wild ginseng was exceptionally rare. And this wasn't just any ginseng. Because of the unique, harsh conditions of the rocky slope, the roots were forced to fight for survival, twisting and contorting into the bulbous, ringed shapes that the Asian herbal markets prized above all else. A single mature, deeply wrinkled root from a stressful environment could sell for hundreds of dollars per ounce. The next morning, the real work began. Avery arrived at Lot 42B just as the sun crested the tree line. The property was intimidating. A rusted, sagging chain-link fence separated it from the railroad tracks, and on the other side, Jeb Miller's meticulously ploughed, perfectly flat cornfields stretched to the horizon. Avery didn't bring a tractor. He didn't bring a tiller. He brought heavy leather gloves, a pair of sharp pruning shears, and a specialized digging tool called a sang hoe. To the casual observer, Avery was simply a madman trying to fight a war against nature with hand tools. Martha Higgins, the town's most notorious gossip, drove past slowly in her Buick, rolling down her window just enough to be heard. "Making a lot of progress there, Avery," she called out cheerfully, her eyes darting over the chaotic brush. "Should have a fine harvest of nettles by October." Avery just tipped his hat, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Morning, Martha. Just getting some fresh air." He had to be meticulously careful. If he cleared too much of the canopy, the delicate ginseng plants would be exposed to direct sunlight and scorch. If he revealed the distinct red berries and leaves too clearly, someone in town might recognize what was growing there. His task was a delicate surgical operation, manually cutting back the suffocating briars and aggressive weeds while leaving the natural shading intact. For 3 brutal weeks, Avery worked from dawn until dusk. His hands blistered beneath his gloves, his arms were crisscrossed with deep scratches from the thorny brambles, and his back ached with a deep, persistent throb. He carefully mapped out the colony in a waterproof notebook. He counted over 300 mature plants, some of which had root necks, rhizomes indicating they were well over 30 years old. By the end of the month, he had effectively rescued the colony from being choked to death, yet from the road, the lot still looked exactly the same, a messy, unkempt patch of weeds. Avery wanted it that way. The best security system for a small fortune in rare herbs was the town's own stubborn ignorance. But the town's ignorance was about to take a hostile turn. By mid-July, Oakhaven was sweltering under a brutal, dry heatwave. The dust kicked up by the passing pickup trucks coated everything in a fine, powdery brown film. At Betty's Diner, the local farmers gathered every morning to complain about the weather, the commodities market, and, increasingly, Avery Pendleton. "It's an absolute disgrace," Jeb Miller complained loudly over his plate of eggs and bacon, making sure his voice carried to the back booths. "I got thousands of dollars of prime seed in the ground, and right next door, this city reject is cultivating a breeding ground for pests. I saw grasshoppers the size of sparrows coming out of that weed patch." Mayor Harrison, nursing a black coffee, nodded sympathetically. "I've had a few complaints, Jeb. It's an eyesore. Drops the property value of the whole eastern grid." Avery, sitting quietly at the counter with his tea, kept his eyes on his newspaper. He knew the pressure was mounting. Wild ginseng needs time to pull the late summer nutrients down into the root before the autumn harvest. If he harvested now, the roots would be lightweight and drastically less valuable. He just needed to hold out until late September. But Jeb Miller wasn't a man who liked waiting. 2 days later, Avery arrived at Lot 42B to find a heavy white envelope tacked to the rusted fence post. It was a formal citation from the Oakhaven Zoning Board. Notice of ordinance violation. Failure to maintain agricultural zoning standards. Presence of unmanaged noxious weeds and overgrowth. Penalty $500 fine per week until cleared, or the county will exercise the right to seize and clear the property. Avery's stomach dropped. $500 a week. He checked his bank account balance on his phone. He had barely $800 left to his name. If the county brought in a brush hog to mechanically clear the land, they would rip the priceless ginseng roots to shreds, destroying the entire colony in minutes. He drove straight to the Oakhaven Town Hall, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mayor Harrison sat behind his massive oak desk, looking distinctly unapologetic. "Avery, I assume you're here about the notice." "This is private property, Mayor," Avery said, keeping his voice level despite the anger boiling in his chest. "I bought it fair and square at the county auction." "And the county has ordinances to protect the surrounding agricultural operations," Harrison countered smoothly, leaning back. "Jeb Miller is the biggest taxpayer in Oakhaven. He's concerned your experiment is going to spread blight and pests into his corn. Now, Jeb is a reasonable man. He authorized me to make you an offer. He'll buy the lot off you for $100. You double your money, you walk away, and we waive the fines." Avery saw the trap perfectly laid out. Jeb didn't care about the pests. He hated the fact that someone was defying the neat, orderly aesthetic of his kingdom. It was about control. "I'm not selling," Avery stated flatly, "and I'm not growing noxious weeds. I am actively cultivating the land." "Cultivating what exactly?" The mayor scoffed. "Thistles." "Specialty botanicals," Avery replied cryptically. "If you send a brush hog onto my property, I will file an injunction for the destruction of high-value crops." The mayor laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "High value on lot 42. B. Listen to me, Avery. You have exactly 14 days to show us a recognized managed crop on that land, or the fines begin. And if you can't pay them, we foreclose." Avery walked out of the town hall with a ticking clock echoing in his head. He had 2 weeks. He couldn't harvest the ginseng early, but he had to do something to prove the land was being managed without giving away the secret. He spent the next 3 days meticulously terracing the lower visible edge of the slope. He ordered cheap, fast-growing buckwheat seed and planted it in neat, perfectly straight rows along the perimeter facing Jeb's farm. It was a decoy, a bright green, undeniable sign of management that distracted the eye from the dense, shaded canopy higher up the rocky slope where the real treasure hid. Then the weather broke. And it didn't just break. It shattered. In the second week of August, a massive unseasonal storm front stalled over Oakhaven. For 3 days, torrential rain pounded the valley. The Oakhaven River breached its banks, and the flat, heavily tilled clay soils of the commercial farms quickly turned into impassable bogs. Jeb Miller's perfectly flat cornfields, stripped of any natural deep-rooting cover crops, flooded disastrously. The standing water suffocated the roots of his crop, turning the lower stalks a sickly, rotting yellow. Jeb spent 48 hours furiously digging drainage trenches in the pouring rain, losing thousands of dollars with every hour the water sat stagnant. But over on lot 42, the useless rocky slope proved its worth. The steep grade and the highly porous, gravel-heavy soil acted as a perfect natural filtration system. The heavy rain cascaded down the slope, watering the deep-seated ginseng roots perfectly, before draining away harmlessly into the railroad gully. The thick canopy of native brush absorbed the heavy impact of the raindrops, preventing any soil erosion. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on the 4th day, Avery's patch of weeds was lush, vibrant, and entirely unharmed. Avery walked the perimeter of his fence, inspecting the decoy buckwheat, which had sprouted aggressively in the humidity. He felt a rare moment of triumph. He had survived the storm, and he had survived the zoning deadline. He unlatched the hidden gate he had built into the brush and began his slow, careful climb up the rocky slope to check on the central ginseng colony. The leaves were just beginning to show the very first faint hints of yellow, the signal that the roots were drawing in their final stores of energy for the autumn. They were almost ready. In just a few more weeks, he would carefully unearth a harvest worth upwards of $10,000. But as Avery reached the upper terrace, perfectly hidden from the road, his triumphant smile vanished. There, in the soft, freshly rain-soaked mud beneath a massive oak tree, were 2 deep, clearly defined boot prints. They were large, much larger than Avery's, and featured the distinct heavy tread of a commercial work boot. Avery's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He dropped to his knees, his eyes scanning the undergrowth. A few feet away, the soil had been violently disturbed. A small patch of the protective bramble had been hacked away with a machete, and a crude hole had been dug. Next to the hole lay the crushed, discarded leaves of a mature, wild ginseng plant. Someone hadn't just been trespassing. Someone had recognized the plant. They had taken a sample root. Avery touched the edge of the boot print. The mud was still wet, the edges sharp. Whoever it was, they had been here this morning. The town's mockery had kept his secret safe for months. But now the illusion was shattered. Someone in Oakhaven knew exactly what was buried in the weeds of Lot 42B, and they were coming back for the rest of it. Avery stared at the crushed leaf in the mud, the reality of the situation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The secret was out. In the clandestine high-stakes world of wild herb foraging, illicit sang hunters were notoriously ruthless. They did not respect property lines, they ignored conservation laws, and they certainly did not care about the delicate ecosystem of a rocky slope. If a poacher knew there was a virgin patch of 30-year-old Panax quinquefolius on Lot 42B, they would not wait. They would return under the cover of darkness, strip the hillside bare, and aggressively rip even the immature seedlings from the earth, destroying the colony's future forever. Avery had planned to wait another 3 weeks for the first frost to maximize the root's medicinal weight, but that luxury was gone. The harvest had to happen tonight. He immediately abandoned the site, driving his battered pickup truck, not to his home, but to a sporting goods store 2 counties over to avoid the watchful gossiping eyes of Oakhaven. He purchased 4 battery-powered trail cameras equipped with infrared night vision, a heavy spool of dark green paracord, and a dozen 12-gauge perimeter trip alarms, perfectly legal devices that fired ear-shattering, non-lethal blanks when a tripwire was snagged. By the time Avery returned to Lot 42, the sun was bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the horizon. The oppressive humidity of the August evening clung to his skin. He moved with practiced silent efficiency, scaling the steep, uneven terrain. He strategically mounted the trail cameras at waist height, angled toward the easiest access points of the ravine. Then he wove the heavy paracord through the thickest, most impenetrable stands of thorny blackberry bushes, creating a deceptive funnel that would force any intruder toward a single steep, muddy path. Across that path, hidden beneath ferns, he rigged the trip alarms. With his perimeter secured, Avery clicked on a red lens headlamp, which preserved his night vision and was less visible from the road, and dropped to his knees. Harvesting wild ginseng is an art form, a delicate surgical extraction. Avery used his sang hoe, a specialized single-handed tool resembling a heavy curved ice pick. He located the first mature plant, its 5-pronged leaves drooping in the evening heat. He gently pressed the tool into the rocky soil 6 inches away from the main stem, carefully loosening the dense clay and gravel. He dug with his bare hands, his fingertips tracing the fragile, sprawling lateral roots. A premium wild root was valued by its human-like shape and the intricate concentric stress rings on its surface. Snapping a single leg or breaking the gnarled neck at the top would slash its market value by half. For 4 agonizing hours, Avery worked in the suffocating darkness. Mosquitoes feasted on his neck, and his fingernails cracked and bled from the sharp stones. But he did not stop. One by one, he extracted magnificent bulbous roots, some as thick as a man's thumb, twisted into bizarre, beautiful shapes by decades of fighting the harsh Oakhaven terrain. He placed them reverently into a padded, damp canvas sack. At 1:15 a.m., the silence of the valley was violently shattered. Bang! The sharp explosive crack of a 12-gauge blank echoed off the surrounding hills like a cannon shot. Immediately, A panicked shout rang out from the lower terrace, followed by the frantic thrashing of heavy bodies tangled in dry brush. Avery killed his headlamp, instantly melting into the shadows of a massive oak tree. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs. Down below, beam from a heavy industrial flashlight pierced the darkness, wildly sweeping across the trees. "I told you he had booby traps, you idiot!" A harsh, panicked whisper hissed. Avery recognized the voice instantly. It was Brody Higgins Martha's notoriously troubled nephew, a man well known around town for small-time theft and unpaid bar tabs. "Shut up and keep the light down," a second voice commanded. This voice made Avery's blood run cold. It belonged to Deputy Carl Jenkins, the local law enforcement officer who was supposed to patrol the Eastern Grid. Jenkins was heavily in debt and deeply corrupt, often turning a blind eye to Jeb Miller's illegal pesticide dumping. Now he was moonlighting as an armed poacher. "We know it's up here," Deputy Jenkins muttered, his heavy boots slipping on the wet rocks. "I saw the three-pronger this morning. That city fool is sitting on a gold mine. We grab 20 pounds of wet root, we're out of here by 2 a.m., and nobody knows a thing." Avery watched from the high ground. They were 30 yards away, struggling against the artificial funnel he had created with the paracord and briars. They were armed, desperate, and entirely out of their element on the treacherous slope. Avery didn't panic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the remote control for his truck, which was parked legally on the dirt shoulder, just outside the rusted chain-link fence, 100 yards below. He pressed the red panic button. The truck's horn began to blare in a continuous, deafening rhythm, the headlights flashing violently, illuminating the entire lower perimeter. The sudden explosion of noise and light threw the poachers into utter chaos. "The cops!" Brody screamed, utterly confused, dropping his shovel. "I am the cops, you moron!" Jenkins yelled back, swatting at the thorny vines that ripped at his uniform. He set off the alarm. "If someone calls this in, and I'm found trespassing on duty, I'm ruined. I'm not going to jail over a weed." Brody panicked, shoving past the deputy, and scrambling recklessly down the steep embankment. Deputy Jenkins hesitated for a fraction of a second, his flashlight beaming directly onto the disturbed soil, where Avery had been digging just minutes before. He saw the empty holes. He knew he had been beaten. Cursing violently, Jenkins turned and retreated, crashing through the brush in a desperate sprint back to his unmarked cruiser. Avery waited in the dark for a full 30 minutes after the taillights of their vehicles vanished down the county road. Only then did he switch his red lamp back on. He worked until the sun broke the horizon, carefully covering the holes, replanting the tiny red seeds from the harvested plants to ensure the colony would eventually regenerate, and packing out over 14 pounds of raw premium wild ginseng. He had survived the night, but the true test of his gamble was still to come. The next 3 weeks were a torturous exercise in patience. Avery locked himself in the basement of his rented farmhouse, transforming it into a makeshift climate-controlled drying room. Raw ginseng is highly susceptible to mold. If dried too quickly with heat, the exterior hardens, while the inside rots, turning a priceless root into worthless mush. If dried too slowly, mildew ruins the medicinal compounds. Avery meticulously laid out the roots on elevated wire racks, running 2 commercial dehumidifiers and large oscillating fans to perfectly mimic a dry autumn breeze. He turned each individual root by hand every 12 hours. As the moisture slowly evaporated, the roots shrank by nearly 2/3 of their weight, but their physical character emerged magnificently. The harsh stress of Lot 42B had done its job. The roots were deeply wrinkled, dense as hardwood, and pale golden brown. This was wild simulated at its absolute peak, indistinguishable from virgin forest growth. When the drying process was finally complete, Avery had exactly 4.8 pounds of pristine, perfectly cured root. It didn't look like much, just a small cardboard box filled with twisted dried flora. But in the right market, it was a king's ransom. He didn't trust the local Appalachian buyers who were known to severely lowball independent foragers. Instead, Avery packed the box into his truck and drove 15 hours straight to Warsaw, Wisconsin, the undisputed ginseng capital of the United States. He had scheduled a private appraisal with Paul Lee, a senior buyer for Shu's Ginseng Enterprises, one of the most prestigious and rigorously authenticated herbal exporters in the world. The corporate office of Shu's was sleek and modern, a sharp contrast to the dirt and sweat of Oakhaven. Paul Lee, an impeccably dressed man in his late 50s with sharp, analytical eyes, welcomed Avery into a sterile, brightly lit grading room. "Mr. Pendleton," Paul said politely, pulling on a pair of white cotton gloves. "You said you had wild Appalachian root. I must warn you, the market is flooded with cultivated root trying to pass as wild. We verify strictly by morphology and age." "I understand," Avery replied calmly. He opened the cardboard box and placed it on the stainless steel table. Paul reached in and picked up the largest root, a heavily ringed bulbous specimen with 3 distinct legs. He held it under a magnifying lamp. The room went completely silent for almost 2 minutes. Paul gently set it down and picked up another, tracing his gloved finger over the tightly packed rings at the neck. "Incredible." Paul breathed, his professional stoicism cracking. "The soil stress on these is profound. The concentric wrinkling, the density. Look at the neck here, Mr. Pendleton. I can count 32 distinct bud scars. This plant survived in the wild for over 3 decades. They were grown in severe rocky clay on a steep incline," Avery explained. "No fertilizers, no tilling, no artificial canopy." Paul looked up, genuine respect in his eyes. This is a vanishing commodity. The Asian luxury markets are starved for roots with this specific wild morphology. We currently pay around $400 a pound for good, wild simulated. But this, he gestured to the box, this is elite grade. I can offer you $2,200 per pound. Avery did the math in his head, his chest tightening. $10,560, Paul stated, tapping his calculator. For the entire lot, paid via certified bank draft today. Avery took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 4 months lifting off his shoulders. The blisters, the mockery, the midnight raid, the crippling anxiety, it had all culminated in this single moment. "I accept," Avery said, extending his hand. 3 days later, the Oakhaven Town Council held its monthly open meeting. The small gymnasium was packed. Jeb Miller sat in the front row, looking exceedingly smug, waiting for the agenda item that would officially foreclose on Lot 42B due to unpaid zoning fines. Mayor Harrison adjusted his microphone, scanning the crowd. "Moving on to item 7, the mayor announced loudly. "The delinquency of the property known as Lot 42B. Mr. Pendleton has failed to pay his accrued zoning fines, which now total $2,000. Therefore, the county is prepared to—" The heavy wooden doors at the back of the gymnasium swung open. Avery walked down the center aisle, dressed in a clean, tailored suit he hadn't worn since his corporate days in Portland. The murmurs in the room died down instantly. Avery approached the council desk and laid a pristine certified bank check down in front of the mayor. $2,000, Mayor Harrison, Avery said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "Paid in full. The fines are settled." Mayor Harrison stared at the check, his jaw slackening. Where did you get this kind of money, Avery? You don't have a crop. You've been growing weeds." Jeb Miller stood up, his face flushing deep red. "It's a trick. He's probably mortgaged the dirt to some predatory lender." "Actually, Jeb," Avery said, turning to face the wealthy farmer, a cool, victorious smile playing on his lips. "I harvested my crop. I sold it to a luxury export firm in Wisconsin." Avery pulled a redacted copy of his sales receipt from his breast pocket and held it up. The bold, undeniable figure of $10,560 was clearly visible to the front row. A collective gasp swept through the room. Martha Higgins nearly dropped her purse. Jeb Miller's eyes bulged as if he were choking on a piece of dry steak. $10,000! Jeb stammered, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. From that rocky, worthless ditch, what in God's name did you grow? I didn't grow anything, Avery replied smoothly. I just knew what to look for. The land provided it. You just couldn't see past your own tractors. Avery looked directly at Deputy Jenkins, who was standing by the exit door. The corrupt officer turned visibly pale and quickly looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the floorboards. And to ensure the long-term viability of my farm, Avery continued addressing the shocked crowd, I have officially filed Lot 42B as a protected botanical sanctuary under state environmental law, which means any further attempts to rezone or brush hog my property will trigger an immediate federal and state environmental lawsuit. The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. The man they had mocked, the fool who had paid $50 for a patch of thorns, had utterly outmaneuvered the most powerful men in Oakhaven. Avery buttoned his suit jacket, turned his back on the stunned council, and walked out into the warm afternoon air. Lot 42B was safe. The seeds were planted for the next generation, and the town of Oakhaven would never, ever laugh at Avery Pendleton again. If you loved this incredible true story of outsmarting the system, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a brilliant underdog victory. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life tales of hidden treasures, agricultural triumphs, and incredible botanical secrets. Have you ever discovered something valuable hidden in plain sight? Drop a comment below and let us know. See you in the next video.